Yes.
At a quarter of 3, right?
That's right. Yes.
So our topic is the ethic of connection, the second of the major contemporary moral visions that we'll be discussing in the course, and the contest between the two of them. And I will now begin the class with an account of this ethic, focusing on what might be its contemporary form, rather than on its canonical Confucianist expression, which was the subject matter of Michael's exposition last week. And that statement then leads me to emphasize the special difficulty of this task that we have set for ourselves. In dealing with the ethic of self-fashioning and nonconformity, we're dealing with ideas that were chiefly expressed in the last 200 years. They're philosophers, they're ideologists, are relatively recent history. And the development of that ethical agenda is intimately related to the most influential political program in the world, the program of world revolution that we've alluded to from time to time. With respect to the ethic of connection, the situation is entirely different. Its canonical formulation was given over 2,500 years ago, and its translation into a contemporary view is a matter of debate and uncertainty. So we have to understand the canonical expression. We then have to translate the canonical expression into some contemporary counterpart to it. And then we have to recognize the alternative possibilities of development of that contemporary version of the ethic. In other words, a much more complicated task. Forgive me in trying to execute this task for the highly schematic character of my account, because it has many steps, many moving parts, and I'll do the best I can given the difficulty of this task. Now first, the central message. The central message of the ethic of connection, understood as a contemporary moral vision, is that what we ultimately have, what we have in the end, is one another. Our interdependence, our intersubjectivity, our joint intentionality is the most important aspect of social life. And if anything deserves to be regarded as sacred, as enjoying a higher measure of authority and of reality, it is this connection among us. It begins not in the isolated ego, encased in a dying body, but in our life together. So the ultimate source of authority, moral and political authority, and in a sense, the most significant reality in the world is what we are together. We are indeed separated from one another and confined to these bodies that are on the way to death. But insofar as we are alive, while we are alive, the primary reality is the reality of interdependence. Now, in our animal natures, we are endowed with the promise or the beginnings of capability that can make us social. That's, as it were, our first nature. But our first nature is only a suggestion of what must later come our second nature, our social nature. Our social nature must be achieved, and it is not already delivered to us by our animal nature. The transformation of our first nature into our second nature, into our social nature, is always an unfinished work. And it is a work which must be developed by two convergent dynamics. One dynamic is objective socially. It is the reorganization of society as a system of roles, and our acceptance of the responsibilities to one another that these roles entail. But the second dynamic is subjective. It has to do with our mental life. It is the development of our imaginative empathy, our capacity to attend to the needs of others on the basis of understanding them. And the development of this subjective power of insight into one another is just as important as the evolution of the system of roles and of the responsibilities that we have by virtue of performing roles. So then the sacred in social life, if there is a sacred, is precisely the social, the interdependent, what we are together rather than what we are apart. And it is the cultivation of that element in our experience which then allows us to struggle against the degeneration of social life into the instrumental use of one another, into a great game of guile, oppression, and force, and to put our own mark on the world. The world, the cosmos, is meaningless and indifferent to our concerns. And what it has in store for us as individuals, as animals, is annihilation. But in this meaningless world, we can create meaning. We can open up this clearing in the natural world, mobilizing some of the forces of nature to our benefit, but above all, developing this area, this island of light, within which we can put the mark of the social upon our experience. Now, that initial statement of the central message of the ethic of connection then leads to a second moment in my exposition, which is the centrality of the ideal of reciprocity to this ethic. And indeed, in Michael's argument last week about role reversal in Confucianism, we could see this role reversal as a variant of the larger idea of reciprocity. It's designed, in fact, to instill the experience of reciprocity in the individual agent by inducing him to imagine the change of his position vis-a-vis others. And the classical expression of the ideal of reciprocity is the so-called Golden Rule, which Confucius stated in a negative form, do not do unto others what you would not have them do unto you, and Christ in the positive form. Now, how are we to understand this norm of reciprocity, this ideal of reciprocity? One way to understand it is by examining its counterparts in law, in the legal imagination, and particularly in the world of contract. So the classical form of contract in modern European legal theory is the bilateral executory promise, the fully bargained out deal for an exchange of performances at some instantaneous moment in the future. And in the law of contract, in that formal law of contract, the arm's length fully articulated bargain, there is the need for good faith. Good faith meaning not taking advantage of unforeseen circumstances to distort the nature of the contract against the other. But the fullest expression of the ideal of reciprocity in contract comes in another kind of contract, what we could call the relational contract. The contract for a series of exchanges in the future, an ongoing contractual relation, which has to maintain a proportion, thus the reciprocity. But the main focus is not on any particular performance. The main focus is on the relation itself and on all the performances that it can generate in the future. It is, in fact, a joint venture, a collaboration. And the sustenance of those collaborations, not expressed in fully articulated bargains, but in incomplete contracts, is a large part of the substance of social life. In that context, good faith means, according to the interests of the other party, a weight at least equal to one's own interests. And that's then the more tangible expression of the ideal of reciprocity that is invoked by the ethic of connection. Now, we could ask again of this ethic, as we asked of the ethic of self-fashioning, whether it has philosophical presuppositions. The attempt in Chinese history to give it a metaphysical grounding must be regarded as, in many respects, a failure and an embarrassment. This was the Neo-Confucianism of the Sung dynasty, for example, which, one might say, rather than strengthening this ethic, weakened it. Nevertheless, it matters what we think the world is like. And there are some visions of what the world is like that seem to be much easier to reconcile with this ethic than others. So I would want to maintain the position that the natural home of this ethic is a loose version of what we earlier labeled temporal naturalism, with the characteristic theses that I mentioned when we discussed the ethic of self-fashioning and nonconformity. There is one real world. In that world, time is real and embraces everything. There is no immutable structure and no unchanging set of regularities governing that fundamental structure of reality. Reality is in constant transformation. In that world, the new is possible, and as an expression of the possibility of the new, history is open. It doesn't have a script that is predetermined, and therefore we have a space for moral and political initiative. The self has unfathomable depth, and the ordinary has more promise than the noble. I claim that those were the elementary philosophical assumptions of the ethic of self-fashioning, and I could say much the same for this ethic in the contemporary form that I want to give it. Now, in dealing with the ethic of self-fashioning and nonconformity, we observed that its familiar forms bear the mark of particular societies and cultures. And that's what I called in an earlier class the dust of history. Certainly, the ethic of self-fashioning in its unreconstructed form bears the imprint of American culture and American experience. And the ethic of connection, certainly in its canonical form that Michael described last week. But even in some versions of the contemporary form that one might give it, show the influence of certain characteristics of Chinese culture. And what are these characteristics? First, the thoroughgoing naturalism of the predominant tendencies in Chinese culture. The resistance to dualism, to sharp divisions between spirit and matter, between the individual and the social, the dualisms that have been so prominent in the history of Western philosophy. And then the question arises of how this naturalism can be reconciled with transcendence. And then one could say that if there is transcendence in this vision, it is the transcendence of the social, of our interdependence over all of the particular forms of social life. That is what is transcendent. It is not the spirit in the individual or in the creative God, but it is this element in our experience which we have reason to revere. We must attend to one another's needs. We must revere one another. To revere one another, we must recognize one another. We must have this imaginative insight. And the transcendence that can be understood in this tradition is transcendence in this naturalistic context. The second mark is the mark of the devotion, the cult of the family, which has had such a central role in Chinese history. We call it familism. It has a covert role also in the Christian societies. You could say, if the explicit object of devotion is God, the implicit object of devotion in practical Christianity has often been the family. But in Chinese civilization, this focus on the family and the ethical dispositions that are nourished in the family takes on a much more prominent role. Now, in many societies of the past, the most characteristic expression of that prominent role of the emotional attachments nourished in the life of the family was what I described in an earlier class as the sentimentalization of unequal exchange. The characteristic social relation between bosses and underlings, between men and women, between parents and children, was a relation that combined an exchange, inequality in the exchange, that's an unequal exchange, and an overlay on that unequal exchange of an element of allegiance, of sentiment or affect that was reciprocal. Thus the sentimentalization of unequal exchange. Extreme example of that was the way in which social life was viewed by the apologists of slavery in the American South. It's one big happy family, in other words, meaning that it was a sentimentalized version of this world of unequal exchange, of hierarchy, the hard realities of coercion, muffled, softened by this claim of reciprocal allegiance. Confucius, even in his own time, was criticized by his opponents as defending a version of this sentimentalization of an equal exchange. And it was, I think one has to say, an unfair accusation, because even in his own time, he defended an alternative view. But there's something in the nature of this moral logic which is always threatening to set its mark on this ethic of connection in the form that history has bequeathed to us. Now then there is, of course, meritocracy, the creation of a service elite based on professional responsibility, which was characteristic to a greater or lesser extent of all the great agrarian bureaucratic empires of antiquity. In all of them there was a service elite, there was admission to a service elite to some extent on the basis of capability, but no other society or state went so far in that direction as China. And so this element of meritocracy then becomes a characteristic form of this idea of role-based responsibility. And finally, another element in ancient Chinese culture is a stark contrast between order and anarchy, a rigid view of anarchy, the fear that any break in the order of the regime could then throw the society into a nightmare of political and economic disintegration. And in the Chinese context, this was part of the interaction between a sedentary civilization and its nomadic enemies on its outskirts. So all of these features threaten to leave an influence on the formulations of this ethic. And of course, what we are interested in, if we want to give to this ethic its strongest possible form, is to shake off this dust of history, as we attempted to do with respect to the ethic of self-fashioning and nonconformity. Now, in relation to that idea of the dust of history, it's important to recognize that each of these two great countries or cultures, the American and the Chinese, has a powerful attraction to the opposite. So the Americans are always looking for communitarian or collective solutions to the problems that their radical individualism is unable to solve. And thus the interplay in the United States, in American politics, between the ideals of individual self-fashioning and the search for forms of collective action or community life intermediate between the individual and the state. And the Chinese similarly are powerfully attracted to even to the crude form, or especially to the crude form of the ethic of self-fashioning and nonconformity. And there are many features of their experience which aggravate this appeal. Just to take one example among many, until recently, China was committed to the so-called one-child policy. A family was allowed in principle to have only one child. So the social and moral consequence of this policy was to create a multitude of young narcissists whom their parents and grandparents doted on, but who were destined then, on growing up, to face the massively repressive structure of the Chinese regime, culturally, socially, and politically. An explosive combination of the narcissism of the individual with the repressive character of the structure. But it helps explain why they would be so attracted to the other. And it's interesting that in both cases, in the attraction of the Americans to the ethic of connection and the attraction of the Chinese to the ethic of self-fashioning, they seem to be attracted to the crudest version of the other, because it is the crudest version which supplies the need that they seek to quench. Now, further in the background, placing in the larger context before exploring its ambiguities, we could say that these two moral visions exercise in the contemporary world the influence that they do because they are related to two great functional imperatives of the contemporary societies. In other words, they're not just abstractions, they're not just ideas that philosophers approve or disapprove. They have an anchor in the real needs of the contemporary societies. And in particular, they are related to the two great functional imperatives of first, the creation of the capable agent, the enhancement of personal agency. The societies need an agent who is able to stand up and act and create, to innovate, to engage with his context, but at the same time the development of the higher forms of cooperation. The higher forms of cooperation, I would want to argue, are characterized by a number of attributes that are not in fact developed in the existing societies. First, that the forms of cooperation, economic or political, not be pinned to any particular dogmatic version, that we be able to experiment with them, that there be a plurality of forms of cooperation, and that they be able to coexist experimentally in the same order. For example, that the market economy not be crucified, nailed to the cross of a single version of itself as it was by the classical liberal doctrine. Second, that the cooperative regime is superior to the extent that it is hospitable to innovation. Every innovation threatens the established regime of cooperation because it ignites a conflict over who wins or who loses over the innovation, whether the innovation is conceptual, technological, organizational, or institutional. And you could say, what is the best cooperative regime? The best cooperative regime is the one that attenuates this conflict. And that problem helps explain why these two great functional imperatives, although complementing each other, are also in tension with each other. And then another characteristic of these higher forms of cooperation is that they would not require any human being to do the work that could be done by a machine. So the machine expresses an algorithm or a formula. The machine does for us what we have learned how to repeat so that we can preserve our time for the not yet repeatable. These two moral visions that we're discussing are related to those two functional imperatives. The ethic of self-fashioning has a special closeness to the imperative of the creation of the agent, the enhancement of agency, and the ethic of connection has special closeness to the development of the higher forms of cooperation. The tension between those two functional imperatives is reflected in what I will later argue to be the impossibility of achieving a seamless marriage, a synthesis of those two moral visions. Now, having said all of that, and having suggested the elements of a contemporary version of the ethic of connection, let me now explore two different directions in which it could, in the contemporary societies, be developed. One of them I'm going to call the minimalist form of the ethic of connection, and the other, the maximalist form of the ethic of connection. And they correspond respectively to the uncorrected and the corrected versions of the ethic of self-fashioning. In other words, what I'm going to call the minimalist version of the ethic of connection is the counterpart to the unrevised form of the ethic of self-fashioning. And the maximalist version of the ethic of connection is the counterpart to the corrected version of the ethic of self-fashioning, the version that emerges from those criticisms that we discussed a few weeks ago. And what are the criteria by which I want to contrast the minimalist and the maximalist version? By two criteria that are connected in some complicated way. So the first criterion is, to what degree does the ethic of connection take as its template the established organization of social life? Is it an attempt to humanize the established form of social life, to set the mark of the social on it, or does it require a thoroughgoing reshaping of the institutions and the ideological presuppositions with which they are associated? That's the first standard of distinction between the minimalist and the maximalist form. But that's connected with a second standard of distinction. To what extent does this contemporary version of the ethic of connection allow for contradiction and disharmony in the self and in personal experience? So the minimalist version is a version that proceeds toward integration and harmony. Not just social integration and harmony, but integration and harmony in the personality, in the self. And there is also in Confucius's own statement in the Analects, an early version of this ideal of harmonious development. Confucius said, "At 15, I set my heart on learning. At 30, I took a stand. At 40, I no longer had any doubts. I no longer suffered from perplexities. At 50, I understood the mandate of heaven. At 60, my ear was attuned. And at 70, I could follow my heart's desire without overstepping the bounds of right." In other words, the key to this progression in the moral development of the individual is the last stage, what happens when he's 70. What happens when he's 70 is that he overcomes heteronomy, that is, the experience that the rule, the moral or political rule, is something imposed on him from outside. And heteronomy is achieved by what Immanuel Kant in the West called the holy will. The will that spontaneously desires what it ought to desire, and it no longer experiences this formation of the will as something that is imposed on it, but something that emerges organically from within it. So that's a conception of the achievement of a final harmony. The self at last at rest, at peace with itself, all passion spent. As opposed to the other idea, which is that the contradictions in the self remain, captured in the vocabulary that I used early on in our arguments when I spoke about the contradictory character of self-assertion. In the relation of the self to others, that we need them, but we also need to escape the jeopardy in which they place us. We need to connect, but somehow to overcome the price of connection in subjugation and loss of personal distinction. We need to engage in a particular world, because unless we're engaged, we're not free. But we can engage and surrender without then losing the self. So we have to be able to engage without surrendering, denying the last word to the social order and keeping the last word for ourselves. Somehow to be insiders and outsiders at the same time, and to find a worldly expression of Christ's command to be in the world without being of it. And in the relation of the self to itself, we need to form a coherent way of being, a character, but we need to prevent this character from becoming a mummy, a carapace, a shell that sucks the life out of us. We need to be able to form a coherent way of being, but at the same time to disrupt it from within. And all of those are examples of contradiction or disharmony in the moral experience of the self, which would interrupt this progression toward the holy will, the will in which We spontaneously desire what we ought to want. Those are the two criteria, and they are related to each other in some complicated way, because the refusal to take the established order of society as the template which we need only to humanize is connected to this idea of imperfection, of contradiction in the self. Now, we can define then this contrast between the minimalist and the maximalist version of the ethic of connection by reference to three great problems, which I'm going to call the problem of subjugation, the problem of disunion, and the problem of coldness. Of these three problems, the first two are classical, recognized problems of modern social theory. In fact, I would say the two most important recognized problems. The problem of subjugation, famously studied by Karl Marx, and the problem of disunion by the great classics of sociological theory like Emile Durkheim and Ferdinand Tönnies. The third problem, the problem of coldness, is not recognized by any version of social theory, but it is, I want to argue, a problem that we should recognize, and another way in which we can distinguish the intentions of the minimalist and the maximalist views of the ethic of connection. So first, the problem of subjugation. The problem of subjugation arises because in the contemporary complex societies, there must be a structure of coordination. And this structure of coordination and of specialization, which also depends on the existence of a state apparatus, creates the opportunity for the capture of the society, of its institutions, and of the state by particular classes and groups, who can then advantage themselves. And so that's how the problem of subjugation arises. There is inequality in these complex societies, and the inequality can become radical, it can become severe, and it then becomes an obstacle to the development of this interdependence that the ethic of connection so values. Now, what is the solution to subjugation? And there are two lines of solution. One line of solution, in the contemporary vocabulary of policy, we would say the characteristic tools are first compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer. So, for example, if there is economic inequality that is anchored in the hierarchical segmentation of the system of production, because there's a division, an abyss between the advanced and the backward forms of production, as in today's insular knowledge economy, which exists in the form of a series of islands or fringes that exclude the vast majority of workers and of firms. The solution then is to allow the market to work its magic of creating wealth, but then to compensate for its inequalities by progressive taxation and redistributive social entitlements. The problem then is that we create a contradiction between the logic of the established economic arrangements and incentives to save, to invest, and employ, and the push toward the equitable attenuation of the inequalities by tax and transfer. And that tension then is captured in the familiar rhetorical apparatus of the tension between efficiency and equity. So as a practical matter, if we entrust the cause of equality to this compensatory redistribution, all we can achieve, in fact, will be some attenuation of the radical inequality. And as the historical experience of the European social democracies shows, we will only have invested in the capabilities of the people but we will not have fundamentally redressed the foundations of economic inequality. So the historical achievement of European social equality, social democracy, is to achieve a very high level of investment in people and in their capabilities, but without, however, have fundamentally altered the inequalities of the economic regime. So that's one policy. The second policy is meritocracy. The creation of people with specialized professional capabilities and the filling of the roles of society on the basis of these differential capabilities achieved through education. And the third instrument in the contemporary societies comes under the label of the discourse of inclusion, diversity, and identity politics. So the ways of having the different groups in society recognized in the superior economic and educational institutions, their place assured under this discourse. Now, all of that together, all of those policies together, compensatory redistribution, meritocracy, and diversity, amount in the end to a kind of humanization of the existing order, not to its reinvention. And so what's the alternative that the maximalist version of the ethic of connection proposes? The alternative version is to give structural solutions to structural problems. If, for example, there is a hierarchical organization of the production system, deepening the abyss between the vanguards and the rearguards, the solution is to close that abyss by developing a path that goes from the knowledge economy for the few that we have to the knowledge economy for the many that we lack. Deepening and disseminating the advanced forms of production throughout the economy and opening the gateways of access to it. That would be an example. But that would have to go together with a change in the relation of labor to capital and with a change in the relation of finance to the real economy, so that free labor became really free, but could at the same time, under a regime that could at the same time ensure the aggregation of resources at scale, and so that finance was enlisted in the service of the productive agenda of society rather than being allowed to serve itself and to use the transactions of the real economy as a pretext. So the maximalist version of the ethic of connection addresses the problem of subjugation with an agenda of piecemeal but cumulative structural change. The reorganization of the market economy, the democratization of the market order, including the development of a socially inclusive form of the most advanced practice of production, and the substitution of the flawed, weak democracies of today by high-energy democracies that heighten the level of popular engagement in political life, hasten the pace of politics, rapidly resolving impasse, and combine a facility for decisive action by the central government with radical devolution, using, for example, the federal system as the device of experimentation that is supposed to be, but under its canonical form is not. Now the problem of disunion. The problem of disunion was the problem described by the classics of sociological theory, and it arises because these complex societies depend on functional differentiation, on specialization. The earlier societies, Durkheim said, depend on what he called mechanical solidarity. That is, they're segmented, but their segments mirror each other. So they're all, in a sense, the same. The principle of union is then similarity or affinity. Now we have this intense differentiation in society, and the question of union is, how can there be social cohesion when the functional elements of the society are so radically different in what they do and what they have become? Now, what is the solution of a minimalist version of the ethic of connection to this problem? I think the best way to interpret the minimalist solution is to say that it relies on a combination of role-based responsibilities, the strong suit of the ethic of connection also, in which the occupant of every role occupies those roles in a way that is designed to attend to the needs of others. But that's not enough, because there's a second element, which is the development of this imaginative capacity to see beyond the role. And this is what, in the Confucianist canon, was called humanity. To recognize in the other not just the occupant of another role, but a human being. And is this element of a generalized benevolence sustained by imaginative insight into the other that goes beyond the frontiers of the role. That's, I think, the essence of the minimalist response to the problem of disunion. And what would be the maximalist response in the same spirit of always preferring structural change to humanization? The maximalist answer would be that it is the multiplication of forms of collective action in the economy, in politics, and in civil society outside the market and outside the state. In other words, social capital, our interdependence on one another, is not a constant, it's a variable. And it's something that we can create or produce through the way in which we organize or reorganize the market and the state and civil society itself. And therefore, the differences that we create matter much more than the differences that we inherit. The nation should be reinterpreted as a form of moral specialization within mankind. We should, and our objective should be to equip each nation with the instruments by which to create new difference. In other words, difference is not the problem, as it was in classical liberal theory. Difference is the solution. And if the nations want then to affirm their identity, their sovereignty, but they give up more and more parts of themselves, the collective identities are eviscerated, they're hollowed out at the altar of worldwide competition, then this desire to be different can only be the object of an intransigent faith. It's not porous like real difference is. It's an abstraction. And the solution is to make the abstraction concrete, to give the nations the political and economic and educational instruments with which to create new difference. That's the maximalist solution to the problem of disunion. Now, the most difficult problem to address is the third. It's the problem that I'm calling the problem of coldness. And it has no canonical expression in modern European social theory, but we can give it one. There's some indirect elements that we can mobilize, and for example, Max Weber's ideas of charisma, or Sigmund Freud's ideas of cathexis and decathexis. Let's understand it going back to Schopenhauer's talk about the porcupines. Remember the porcupines. They huddle together in the cold night. And they come closer together to warm one another. And then they prick one another with their spines. And then they go apart and closer and further, back and forth restlessly until they settle into an uncomfortable middle distance. That middle distance describes the situation in which what I'm calling the problem of coldness arises. Or a society prodigal in what Madame de Stael at the beginning of the 19th century described as the meetings that deprive us of solitude without affording us company. Those are the contemporary societies. So they take this logic of the sentimentalization of unequal exchange, which was the fundamental moral and social logic of many societies in the past. They unpack the elements. So then there's exchange for the market, power for politics, and affect or allegiance in the family and in private life. But when they do all of that, then in becoming freer, relatively freer, they also become colder. And thus the characteristic mark of American sociability, which is a cheerful and personal friendliness. So distance and coldness. So then the question arises, how can we become free but remain warm? How can warmth be reconciled with freedom? And it seems to me that the terms of this problem have to be completely rethought. That the minimalist response to this problem is that this warmth in surrounding social life arouses from some refracted, diluted radiance of personal life. That is, the habits, the emotions, cultivated in the life of friends and a family, spreads out to society through this generalized benevolence to which the representatives of the ethic of connection have always appealed. Now, what is the alternative to that? The alternative to that is to seek fire in another place, and to seek fire in the imagination. Now remember, what is the imagination? The imagination, the two defining moves of the imagination are removal from the phenomenon. A memory is, an image is the memory of a perception, not the perception. But then comes the second decisive move, which is to subsume the actual under a range of variation. Now, the way we understand anything is by understanding what it can become. Not what it can ultimately become, the ultimate possibilities, but the proximate or adjacent possibilities, the transformative opportunities in the domain of the adjacent possible. And so we rob the actual phenomenon of some of its just there-ness, its brute facticity, by making it more intelligible, by placing it in this context of transformative variation. That's how we understand anything. Because if we don't understand it transformatively in that way, we don't understand it at all, we just stare at it. And then thought degenerates into a kind of retrospective rationalization. Now, this is what the maximalist might want or should want on this view that I'm suggesting to you. The maximalist should want the political and economic institutions to be a tangible collective embodiment of the imagination. For them to do what I'm saying that the imagination does. For them to be the perpetual creation of the new, to subsume the actual under a range of transformative variations, for them to be a democratic experimentalism, and then the affect tone of ordinary social life would be raised up in this fire of the imagination, in which there wouldn't be this simple alternation between the ordinary moves that we make within a framework of assumptions and arrangements that we take for granted, normal social life, and the extraordinary moves by which from time to time, typically under the provocation of crisis, we challenge and change part of the framework. Those two moves would draw closer together. And the normal would take on some of the character of the extraordinary, because the normal routines and institutions of social life would be the embodiment of the imagination. And that's where the warmth comes from. Not the pretense that we love the stranger, that it's this radiance of personal life, but the substitution in life among strangers of this personal affect by the fire of the imagination. Now, of course, if we compare these two projects, the minimalist and the maximalist, one of them is entirely familiar. It has close counterparts in the existing world. The other evokes something that we don't have, right? It's a promise or a prophecy. It's the anticipation of a hope. And we could broadly describe this contest as a contest between the humanizers and the divinizers. How should I say? Divinizers. The humanizers and the divinizers. That is, the object of the minimalist project is to humanize society. The object of the maximalist version is to make us more human by making us more godlike, on the assumption not that we become more not that we live in order to become more godlike, but that we become more godlike in order to live. And we achieve this expression of our interdependence, of our joint intentionality, by raising social life up, ordinary social life, to a higher level of energy. Embodying in our prosaic experience the godlike attribute of transcendence. Now, having stated that contrast, and these two very unequal parts of it, these representatives with respect to subjugation, disunion, and coldness, I come then to the final question in this exposition, which is, to what extent we can hope for some synthesis of these two moral visions that we're exploring. The ethic of self-fashioning and the ethic of connection. Now, it would be very easy to formulate a synthesis rhetorically. For example, all of us who are lawyers would have no trouble doing that. It's a simple invention of a language which appears to paste together elements of these two ideas. That's an easy operation, and we can be more or less virtuosistic in the performance of the operation, but it's entirely doable. But this is a trivialization of the problem, right? Because this is not a shell game, and the object is not consolation and edification. It's not to add to the long list of lullabies with which we have been put to sleep by the history of philosophy and of religion. It's to face the real problem. And these ideas they live because they relate to real forces in society, as the discourse about the functional imperatives was intended to suggest. Now, if we look at it with that precaution, with that intention, we see that two things are certainly true. The maximalist version of the ethic of connection, as I have described it, is less distinct from the corrected version of the ethic of self-fashioning than the uncorrected version of the ethic of self-fashioning is from the minimalist version of the ethic of connection. Their primitive, unreconstructed forms are the forms that are most apart. So they do draw closer together when we correct them. In their interrogation of society and in their admission of conflict and disharmony in the self, in the personality. But in drawing closer together, I want to say they do not become the same. And it's also true that they have a wide range of similar political implications. That is, the maximalist version of the ethic of connection and the reconstructed version of the ethic of self-fashioning could point in the same direction. I described the direction of the ethic of self-fashioning as a politics of deep freedom, and it is related to this way in which the maximalist ethic of connection would respond to the problems of subjugation, disunion, and coldness. So we're left with this idea that a difference remains. Now, where can we locate exactly this difference? The difference even between the reconstructed version of the ethic of self-fashioning and the maximalist version of the ethic of connection. And I said this before when we were speaking about the ethic of self-fashioning. So first, the point of departure. The point of departure for the ethic of self-fashioning, even when corrected and criticized, is the isolated ego, inseparable from its body on the way to death. The point of departure of the ethic of connection is our relation to one another. Not I, but me and you. Our interdependence, our joint intentionality, our second nature. Our second nature is our real nature, always incomplete, an incomplete work, as I say, an unfinished work, but the most real and authoritative and reliable thing that we have in our experience. Now, the second difference lies in this impression of this promise or prophecy of radical transcendence in the revised ethic of self-fashioning. And radical transcendence stating then that there is more in us than there is or ever can be in the social and conceptual worlds that we build and inhabit. They are finite in relation to us. We are infinite in relation to them. We spill over this character of extravagance, of exuberance, of surfeit, is part of what we mean by transcendence. But viewed in this way, it seems to me, there is a conflict between this idea of transcendence and the thoroughgoing naturalism and moral realism of the ethic of connection. Now, a third remaining contrast has to do with the relation of these two ethics to a world historical event, which is the revolutionary project that has engulfed humanity in the last 300 years. Remember, I claimed that this project has always had two sides. It's had the political side, carried by the doctrines of democracy, liberalism, and socialism. And it's had the personalist side, carried especially by romanticism and the global popular romantic culture. With the promise that the ordinary man and woman is not so ordinary after all, but can ascend, that we can ascend together to a higher life with broader capabilities, with greater intensity, with larger scope. And that project, I said, remains the strongest project in the world because although it has many enemies, it continues to command the agenda. All the other projects in the world respond to it. But it is also paradoxically weak because its adepts no longer know what its next step should be, on either the political side or on the personalist side. I interpret the agenda of our course here as being, in a sense, the exploration of what the next steps on the personalist side would be, given that the main focus here is not on institutional reconstruction of the market or the state or civil society. The ethic of self-fashioning in any of its forms is inseparable from the history of this project. It was born as part of this project. Its history is inseparable from the history of this project. Its ideologists were also ideologists of that project. It can't disentangle itself from that project. It shares its fate. But the ethic of connection, although it's not necessarily against that project, especially in its maximalist form, does not have this intimate relation to that project. And as I earlier suggested, the defenders of the ethic of connection might think that under this mantle of the idea of revolution and the perpetual creation of the new lurks the poison of self-aggrandizement and vanity. And that then leads to the fourth element of distinction between these two ethics, even when they are transformed or criticized in the way which we have suggested, which has to do with their moral psychology. For the ethic of self-fashioning, even in its reconstructed form, the disruptors are the saving remnant of humanity. They are the spiritual aristocracy of the human race. And what we want is for their message to be generalized within all of humanity. And the defenders of the ethic of connection cannot be so sure, because disruption is also self-aggrandizement and vanity. So there you have it. If the discussion ends in this inconclusive point of of a lasting duality in our moral consciousness, that duality is yet another expression of our limits in the use of reason to elucidate our predicament, right? Of another instance of what we call the cognitive gap. That is, the most important subject, the subject of how we should live or what we should do with our lives, is a subject about which we can reason. And we can provide arguments for or against these different spiritual options in the history of humanity. But the weight of the problem always seems disproportionate to the weight of the arguments. The arguments are inconclusive, and the problem is inescapable. And if there is such a duality, or at least such a duality in our present experience, we could take it as yet another example of this cognitive gap, and thus of our finitude. And of course, the background to our finitude is our transcendence. The thesis, which rehearsed at many different moments in the argument of the Course, that everything in our existence points beyond itself.
Wonderful. Let us open this up for conversation.
Will you begin, Michael?
Oh, okay, sure. Let me actually begin with some brief footnotes, and then we will open this up. So let me just underline a few of Roberto's points here. So as Roberto has been arguing, and we'll begin here with the long vision underlying this course, we have repeatedly noted these extraordinary revolutionary moments, the so-called Axial Age. Then these ideas get taken over by the imperial powers that were in the ancient period, the Han Empire and the Roman Empire, particularly for the two in question here. Then the emergence of these salvationist religions, pulling back on these Axial Age ideas, but then trying to revivify them and give them again their incredible power. And then we've noted how, again, they became institutionalized. This very intriguing parallelism continues. So as Roberto has mentioned, at roughly the same time, 12th century, so what we now call the High Middle Ages, you get the emergence of Neo-Confucianism, which is an attempt to reread the Confucian tradition in a way that at least we find very, very dangerous. The exact same time in Christianity, this is when you get the rereading of Christianity in terms of the great chain of being, this notion that social hierarchies, even racial inequalities, are God-given, and your goal is simply to live within the role that you were born into because the structure of society
And the marriage
is
of
God.
Greek philosophy
Yes.
and the marriage of the Christian religion to Greek philosophy.
Precisely.
To the Greek philosophy.
Precisely. And both of these, what we would say very dangerous readings of the traditions, have been playing out in the modern period. So to give the obvious examples, that great chain of being, you see versions of this actively being played upon now by right-wing Christian movements, some of which have achieved state power throughout the world. And, as we mentioned last week very briefly, right now in the People's Republic of China, it's that Neo-Confucian version, of course, that is being actively called upon as being the proper Chinese vision. Needless to say, we would strongly disagree with both. And then for us, the question is, how do we reconstruct these two visions in their most powerful form? And as Roberto has said, there's a differential here, although a kind of intriguing one because of the developments of world history over the past 2 centuries. So we have discussed how the Christian version of this came to be secularized, particularly in forms of liberalism, as well as the more powerful visions that we have been discussing, the Emerson and Nietzsche, that we have been trying to reread and correct. There have been versions of the ethics of connection, as Roberto has mentioned, but they sort of shift geographically. So in the 19th century, China, of course, is the subject, as much of the world is, of European imperialism, and the active work of reviving the tradition obviously comes to an end. However, as we noted very briefly last week, a lot of these ideas that were being developed in China are picked up explicitly in the Enlightenment, and this begins to play a role in 19th and 20th century European and American state building. So one aspect of that state building, of course, is liberalism, envisioned as each individual as a mini deity, but the sovereign power means you have sovereign power over your property, and social mobility is achievable by the marketplace in which you will hopefully gain more property. But there's a whole other side that you can trace coming from China, and therefore deeply out of an ethics of connection, that is based upon the idea, and this is only one piece of that ethics of connection, but it's an intriguing one, where you use strong statecraft to try to break down social hierarchies by strongly emphasizing, well, I'll take out strongly for reasons will be obvious, by emphasizing meritocracy and by emphasizing visions of social equality that will be run by the state, not through the marketplace. And this begins to play a significant role, as Roberto has mentioned, in what I would call minimal forms of meritocracy, as they've played out in Europe and America. The most extreme version of this is things like the SAT, which, as we all know, is hardly meritocratic and hardly helpful for training us in any larger sense. But you can trace the genealogy of that back to civil service examinations in China. So it's a minimalistic reading. And as Roberto has said, another minimalistic form of this takes the form of social democracies, where you use, relatively speaking, strong forms of statecraft to do economic redistribution to break down social hierarchies, again, as we know, in a very, very minimal form. So this returns us to then the central question. How would we both rethink these two visions, self-fashioning and the ethics of connection, in their most powerful form, as Roberto has called, in the strongest form of each, the corrected form for self-fashioning, the maximalist form for the ethics of connection? And were we to do so, what would that mean? In other words, avoiding the easy possible moral of the brief history I've just given of saying, well, these visions are at their most powerful when they're not dealing with, say, institutional orders. They're at their most powerful when you're dealing with axial age philosophers or radical salvationist movements. But no, practitioners of these movements were trying to change the world at a larger level, and we should as well. So what would that mean? And Roberto has sketched out what this would mean philosophically, in terms of political theory, and even what this would mean at an institutional level. And let me simply pick up on two final themes of this before we open it up. So one key point that Roberto has mentioned is the notion of divinization. And in full agreement, note the power of the move here. In the minimalist form of the ethics of connection and the uncorrected form, to use Roberto's terminology here, of the self-fashioning, what you have is, in a sense, a humanization. So in the self-fashioning move, liberalism is a humanization of a vision of a transcendent deity, humanized to simply being the individual having control over his or her own property. And in the minimalist version of the ethics of connection, it is a humanization of the world around us, such that we humanize it. In the more powerful form, in the self-fashioning vision, it would be a divinization. So humans become more godlike, not in the minimal sense of being sovereigns over their own property, but by taking on the attributes of God, as understood in the Christian tradition, as a transcendent creative figure. But you don't literally become God, you become that within this world, a radicalized vision of what self-fashioning would be. And building on the ethics of connection, again, it's a divinization, but as we noted briefly last week, note the difference in visions of godhood here, which play out significantly. So as we noted, looking again at the Chinese tradition, where you see the ethics of connection worked out in its most powerful philosophical form, there's not here a notion of a transcendent creative single deity. The vision is that spirits, and it's multiple, spirits are simply the same sort of stuff as exists in energies in the world, but at their most highly refined form, and in the most highly refined form, meaning the most flawlessly resonant with everything else. Meaning that as we become more godlike, in this sense, in the ethics of connection sense, we become more connected, more resonant with those around us, more able to care for those around us, but not out of the caring of me as an individual caring for another individual, but rather because we become more able to flawlessly resonate with each other. And this brings us to Roberto's final point of, is it possible then to have a final synthesis of these two? And I fully agree with Roberto. Of course, as he said, rhetorically, sure, easy. Do we want to philosophically? No. And I would say this not to say we therefore need to choose between them. I would say the tension between them is extraordinarily powerful. Each of them, in their strongest possible form, has an incredibly strong critique to make of the other, but because each has one to make of the other, I think it would be highly dangerous if one of them were to win. And part of the power may be to say, if to some degree the sorts of institutional arrangements we know are a not very good marriage of lesser readings of these two traditions, what would it mean philosophically, and again, politically as well, were we to actually have a tension between these two, each sort of pushing against the other, but in their strongest possible form. Visions of divinization, in other words, with radically different understandings of what divinization would mean, and therefore visions of an institutionalization of this, each of which, as Roberto has said, would be pushing in comparable directions, but because they have both a different starting point and therefore a different end point, would ultimately still be yielding very different personal visions of how to live one's life, very different personal visions of what it would even mean to live life properly and fully and completely. And perhaps it is for the better that that tension would never, ever be allowed to end. So
on that last point, Michael, I think there's there's a defect in the presentation I just gave, that in emphasizing these problems of subjugation, disunion, and coldness, I was drawing attention to the collective or social implications of these ideas. But as we observed in earlier classes, these collective transformations take place in historical time, not in biographical time. And we then, an adequate moral view can't just deal with what we want society to become. It has to deal with what we do in the meantime. If the collective projects do not take place in this collective, in the temporal dimension of our own lives.
Right.
And so there has to be another discourse about the way to live
Yeah.
in the meantime.
Exactly.
And so, for example, in speaking about divinization and giving it the sense of transcendence, you could say there are the virtues of divinization, which are openness to the new and openness to the other. And they're very closely connected. And they have to be cultivated.
Yes.
A willingness, because the other not as the representative of some social category, but as the radical original that we all want to be.
Yes.
And so our openness to the new has this complicated relation to our openness to the other. To see the other outside this stereotype taxonomy of the social categories. But it rests on a series of other virtues, which you could call the virtues of purification, simplicity, enthusiasm, attention. They're the emptying out, they're the focus on what's central rather than on what's peripheral. And they're related to the conception in patristic theology, in the theology of the early church fathers, of this kenosis, which is the abandonment of the peripheral in order to give attention to what's really important. And so we have to develop a discourse about that, together with this collective or institutional discourse about the transformation of society.
Yes, yes. And just as a quick footnote to this, I might add, part of what is intriguing about the Confucian tradition, coming out of the ethics of connection, as we noted very briefly last week, but here to underline, is this becomes one of the focuses. I mean, what is so intriguing about the Confucian tradition, very much unlike a lot of the other major religious movements around the world, is its incredible focus on the common, the mundane, daily, what you do, this vision that the patterns of our lives tend to come out of our mundane life, and therefore change comes out of our mundane life. And so you get this incredible focus on little things, like, as I mentioned last week, Confucius straightening a mat in a certain situation to shift a situation. I mean, these incredibly, seemingly minor, mundane events that become in the Confucian tradition intensely powerful, because the idea is that is where divinization occurs. And so it's in a very almost literal sense that the seemingly grand political and institutional questions are put as what comes after the work we do at the most mundane levels. Yes. Let's open this up for questions, concerns, suggestions, angry rebuttals. Anything is open. Yes, please.
Yeah, so when you were addressing the problem of how we can remain warm.
Can you speak louder?
Oh, yeah. When you were addressing the problem of how we can remain warm while being
Yes.
free,
Yes.
you talked about
How we can be free and warm at the same time.
yes, but then you talked about using the fire of the imagination
Yes.
for personal effect. How is that different from love?
I don't think it is love. So we are commanded, Christ commanded us to love the stranger. And the command seems impossible to implement. So therefore, the moral philosophers offer us instead the cold comfort of an impersonal and altruistic benevolence. So in dealing with this problem, it would be another discussion of in what sense we can truly love the stranger. And I'm not intending to discredit that discussion, but it leads us in a different direction. What I'm saying is that the minimalist solution would go precisely in the direction that you described. That's to say that some lesser form of this affect that we have in the personal domain can radiate out to society. And it is expressed in this generalized benevolence that is cultivated and has an imaginative base, a base in insight that we seek to cultivate, for example, through the study of literature. But my argument was we should look for the fire in a completely different direction. We shouldn't expect life among strangers to be a cooler version of what we experience in the pianissimo of personal life. We should look, there should be fire, but the fire comes from another place. Not from love, not from personal affect, but from imagination. And that's a different idea. And it's related to a practical observation about our situation today, which I do want to emphasize. So we, like the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we have reason to affirm the primacy of structural alternatives over non-structural alternatives. Meaning by structural, alternatives that have to do with the institutions and with the ideological assumptions associated with our institutional commitments. So the way of organizing the market, the way of organizing democracy, the way of organizing an independent civil society outside the state and outside the market. That's what has primacy. And every time we attempt to give a non-structural solution to a structural problem, we do something that's inadequate, as in our policies of redistribution by tax and transfer. So in that sense, we should imitate the liberals and socialists of the 19th century. But in another sense, we can't and we shouldn't imitate them, because they each had their ideological and institutional fetish. So each section, each sect of the liberals or the left had a solution, a dogmatic solution. They said, institute the system of liberal rights and you will be both rich and free. Or have state control of the economy, socialism, and that will give you both freedom and prosperity and so forth. We know too much to believe in the veracity of these dogmas, so we have reason to suspect them. And that then generates a problem without historical precedent. That we need to affirm the primacy of structural alternatives without succumbing, as the 19th century liberals and socialists did, to a structural dogmatism. In other words, for us, one of the most important attributes of the economic and political institutions is that they invite, facilitate, and help organize their own correction in the light of experience. That they have this quality of shaping and ordering experimentalism. Economic and political experimentalism are experiments. And that then leads to this idea of the imagination, because the imagination is the mother, is the master of experiments. That's what the imagination is about. That's what it means to rob the phenomena of some of their just there-ness, their brute facticity, and reimagine them as then variations on a set of possibilities in the domain of the adjacent possible. That's the underlying idea that leads in that direction. Yes.
Something that I've been wondering about is at what scale you're imagining these kind of solutions operating. Because in thinking about some of the abstract ideas about humanization and collectivization, it seems like we're talking about national scales and scales within national societies, national economies, and I wonder what options or necessity there is in a framework.
So I think that in ethics, inevitably, the most important domain in the end has to be the domain of the individual human life, right? Because as I say, we don't live in historical time, and the question is not just what are the options for society, but what are the options for us, given the omissions and failures of politics. So we have to have a view that accommodates both of those things. In the collective space, the main domain of action remains the sovereign state. And so this argument turns into an argument about sovereign states and nationalism. So, and I think we discussed this in an earlier class too. The nations of the world, many of them used to be like tribes, based on similarity and consanguinity. And now they're on a journey toward becoming something else. And this something else are then experiments in different ways of being human under the shield of states, these armed states that exist in the world. So in that journey from being tribes to being an exercise in moral specialization, an accident happens. And the accident is the evisceration of the concrete collective identity. So, for example, in 1859, the Meiji Restoration, the Japanese come to the altar of worldwide military, economic, and ideological competition, and they say, in order to remain independent, not to be taken over, to be invaded by the West, we have to change many of our ways. We have to give up part of ourselves. We have to take out part of ourselves and look around the whole world and see what works as a basis of economic and political power. And then combine these imports, these imitations, with something that is left of our traditional identity and our practices and institutions. So the collective identity is hollowed out from within for the sake of success, of worldly success. That's the accident. And it's an accident in the following way, that then what happens is that the collective identity, the desire to be different rather than waning, is inflamed. As actual difference diminishes, the desire for difference increases. And then we have this peculiarly poisonous character of contemporary nationalism. The two nations live side by side, and they come to hate each other, not because they're different, but because they're becoming alike, and because they want to be different. So it's this impotent rage for difference in the presence of the diminishment of actual difference. Now, actual difference is much less dangerous than imagined difference, because the abstract difference, the desire to be different, can only be the object of an intransigent faith, whereas actual difference is porous by its very nature. Its boundaries are not clear, it's susceptible to compromise. Now, so this is the situation now of this detour that we have now in the nature of the nation. And in relation to the problems aroused by this detour, there are then two main proposals in the world. One proposal is the reactionary proposal of the right, and which is restore the ancient ways, the ancient differences, our collective identity. Fill them up again with the content that they used to have. For the most part, it's a fiction because they can't be filled up with the content that they used to have. And then there's the proposal of liberal cosmopolitanism, which is suppress difference, worldwide convergence to the same best available practices and institutions. And then the differences, the cultural differences, will remain as a kind of folklore, floating disembodied over this reality of institutional convergence. So what I want to say then is the correct solution is equip difference. give the nations of the world the institutional and ideological instruments by which to create new difference. Difference, again, is not the problem. Difference is the solution. And if the differences are real differences, if they're tangible, then they are much more susceptible to combination and compromise than if they are these eviscerated abstract collective identities.
I think I feel caught in a bind between the sense that if we are trying to equip nations to deal with difference, the way in which we do that is have people in positions of power ready to do that, who have the ideas. But the way to get people those ideas is to work on a smaller scale and to teach individual people. So I don't see a way in right now. I'm wondering where to go.
As opposed to what? You mean you not doing it at the national level, doing it in the circle of your immediate acquaintance? Is that what you're suggesting?
I think that is sort of the other extreme of the option. I don't think it's either polarity. But I don't.
Well, depending on the state and in the way its politics are organized, of course. An alternative vision always has to begin on some scale which is graspable or imaginable. And this is the method of the prophet, whether it's a religious prophet or a political prophet. As the prophet offers a direction, but then he has to provide a down payment on the direction that he offers. We were all like St. Thomas. We have to touch the wound in order to believe. And so there has to be some tangible embodiment, some installment on this payment. And so that then leads to this idea. He'll do it somewhere, someplace, not necessarily in the biggest place, but his message will be foreshadowed in some partial experiment. Now, all of this is subject to another problem of a completely different order, which I have to say from my own experience as an individual. It's clear to me that it's easier to change a country than it is to change a person. So, after all, to change a country, you need only to be a statesman. To change a person, you need to be Jesus Christ. It's a much higher level of ambition. And so, on the matter of moral realism, this is a reason to think it's not correct to say that you're more realistic by lowering your sights until you come to the individual. That's much harder. You're laughing, but this is...
I'm laughing because it's so profoundly true.
It's not a laughing matter. Yes.
I have a question kind of along these lines, and
Yes.
I'm hesitant to ask it given what you just said, but nevertheless, why not take a risk? I'm curious, so presumably, stop me if at any point this is too disagreeable to proceed, but everyone in this room is going to fall somewhere along the spectrum of tending towards the ethic of self-fashioning or connection. Like we'll have certain characterological preferences where I like to be this way in the world, this is how I want to conduct my life.
Yes.
I'm curious about in what ways do you two already see these legitimately different ethics putting pressure on one another to change and evolve? Seems like that's a deep thread in this conversation.
So I don't think this is, I think the intention is not to say this is an eternal duality in our moral consciousness. It's a historical approach, and it's saying this is a moment in the political and moral evolution of humanity in which we face the contest in this form. This is a useful contest because we can understand our options in this vocabulary. But I don't think that 100 years from now we're going to think this way. We're going to think in some other way, and the alternatives presented to us will be different. I think it's unlikely that we'll come to some kind of synthesis, but we'll think of the contesting visions in a different way, in some different way.
For sure, I would agree. I hope so. But as of today, in what way do you two feel pressured by this, dialectic, by these competing worldviews and like options to be taken up? To live a
Well,
life? I'm curious about
so
that.
I think what to me is more remarkable is that we didn't explore the claim, and of course it is a very controversial claim, that these two visions have similar political implications for society. So they could serve to justify political arrangements that would then have a different meaning from these two moral standpoints. And so they don't require that the citizens of a democratic state converge in their moral and religious ideas. They allow for the justification of the same public arrangements from different, if you like, theological standpoints. And that also seems to be a very important feature of these views.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Yeah, hi. If I understood correctly, you saw meritocracy as a solution to the problem of subjugation. And if we understand meritocracy very simply, there's problem of subjugation.
Yeah.
And if we understand meritocracy as simply like an individual's social mobility by virtue of only their hard work and credit, that seems to run against the foundation of ethic of connection, which is built on harmony, interdependence, and mutual obligation. So I'm just wondering, how can we reconcile the ideal of meritocracy with the ethic of connection?
No, so they're two different questions, right?
Right. So would meritocracy be actually in conflict with an ethics of connection? Or does it come out of an ethics of connection?
Well, so we have to separate, because meritocracy is like a fighting word, right? It's a word it's a word that carries a lot of baggage. So in this tradition, the idea is one of the dynamics of the creation of this interconnectedness is taking a role and having responsibilities by virtue of occupying certain roles. And then, of course, you need to be trained for the role so that you can help people. It's as simple as that. So I don't know whether that is part of what we mean by meritocracy or not, but it must be at least part of it. But it carries all sorts of other insinuations. So I can understand why they would then think that this could be a basis of social union. So let's go back to Durkheim's formulation of the problem of cohesion. So the idea was, when they were similar, mechanical solidarity, cohesion arose from affinity, from similarity, and ultimately even from consanguinity. It's all one big happy family, one big tribe, and so forth. Now they become functionally different. What is the basis of cohesion? So one idea was it's functional interdependence. But functional interdependence is just practical. So at one moment in his career, Durkheim thought there would have to be an ideal of the individual, of enhanced agency, chastened by professional ethics, the responsibility of roles, and that would then supplement the pure functional interdependence, and there would be this ideological basis of cohesion, which would be the sharing of this liberal ideal. But Durkheim himself recognized that this was inadequate. So the question is, what is adequate? Now, look at the concrete experience of the European social democracies. What was the basis of social cohesion in them? The basis was money transfers organized by the state as an instrument of social solidarity. That is, compensatory redistribution through tax and transfer, against the background of a high level of cultural and social homogeneity. Now, what has happened is that as migratory flows and cultural pluralism erode the background of homogeneity, the inadequacy of money as a social cement becomes obvious. So money was never an adequate social cement, but it seemed to be adequate so long as the background of a high level of homogeneity was in place. So then the background is eroded. What then is the alternative basis of social cohesion? That's how we get to the problem. And that's where I want to say the only adequate basis of social cohesion is direct involvement in other people's lives, is doing things together. And social capital is not just a constant, it's a variable. We can accumulate it by the cooperative character of education, by the existence of mandatory social service, either military or civilian, and by the engagement of organized civil society outside the state, partnering with the state not for profit in the experimental and competitive provision of public services. So the state provides a universal floor of universal public services. The state operates at the ceiling in the development and financing of the most complex and costly public services. But in the broad middle zone between the floor and the ceiling, the state partners with independent civil society, with specialists in health, education, and so forth, in the competitive provision of public services. That's the best way to enhance their quality, and one of the most effective triggers for the self-organization of civil society. So we begin to think then of social capital not just as some mysterious constant, some attribute which a society either has or doesn't have, but as something that we can produce by collective action. That's the idea.
Yes, please.
Yeah, you were talking about like seeking fire or warmth from the imagination, and you said something along the lines of subsuming the actual under transformative variation. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate more on this concept. I think I got just a little lost, like what it would look like to, attain, like receive warmth from the imagination.
So I characterize the imagination by these two moves, right? The move of distancing from the phenomenon, and then the move of subsumption of the actual under a range of adjacent possibles. And I said, that's how we understand anything. And to take one step further in that idea. So the mind has two sides. In one side, the mind is like a machine. It's modular and formulaic. And the other side, the mind is an anti-machine. It's not modular. It's not formulaic. It's plastic. It's non-modular and non-formulaic characters enabled by something physical, which is the plasticity of the brain, but not explained by its physical substrate, right? And it has this power of recursive infinity, of being able to combine anything with anything else. And it has the power which the poet called negative capability. That is, we can discover something that we don't know yet how to make sense of, or that doesn't make sense in the light of our established methods and criteria of sense, and then retrospectively establish the methods and the criteria that make sense of it. That's the imagination. The question is, and the imagination is a fire, because to imagine is to be aroused, to be energized. The imagination breaks the mold of repetition and calls us to life. So then the question is, in what sense or to what extent can the practical arrangements of our institutional life, the institutions of politics and of the economy, embody the imagination and do this collectively? And then I would say that a high energy democracy, which I would define as a democracy that diminishes the dependence of change on crisis, therefore overthrows the rule of the living by the dead, and facilitates the repeated practice of structural reform, is a tangible embodiment of the imagination. And how do we achieve it? We achieve it by elevating the temperature of politics, which is the level of organized popular engagement in political life, and denying the crucial premise of conservative political science and conservative statecraft, which is that politics must either be cold and institutional or hot and anti-institutional. So in other words, at the end of the day, we have to choose between Madison and Mussolini. And it denies the possibility that we can have a politics that is both hot and institutional, a higher level of political mobilization, but in an institutional form. The second set of innovations are hastening the pace of politics. So if there's an impasse, we break the impasse as quickly as possible. We say of democratic politics what Karl Popper said of science. The point is to make mistakes as quickly as possible to resolve the impasse by comprehensive programmatic plebiscites or by early elections. They could be called by either of the political branches of government, but would always be for both branches when they are called. And then the third is that we say it's not true that there's a simple pendular opposition